Okay. This is just going live. Give me a second. Okay. So it is a joy to have our second of four Reitman Scholar Residence presentations with Professor Gil Troy. Just two things before we begin this morning's conversation. I know we're all chomping at the bit to hear part two. I never had the blessing to have met Cyril, but Norman talked about Allison, your mom, a lot. And I know he was deeply in love with her until the moment he passed. But the story that I like sharing every year, and I know you guys have heard this story before, but there's some new faces in the crowd, is my wife Allison used to, when she worked here, used to take her fourth grade class to meet Norman every year on his birthday, starting when he became 100. And she, you know, as one might expect, there are not a lot of these, but I think she did it 5 times, something like that. And every year, the kids got more and more excited about meeting Dr. Reitman, who was still attending Shabbat morning Torah study. Dr. Peskin would pick him up and bring him in every morning. And they would have this moment to hear from Norman about what the history of the synagogue was. We'd be in like Seminar Gimel, and he'd say, I met my wife Cyril in that corner over there, but this was Keller Hall. And every year, without a doubt, one of the kids would ask, how did you get to be 100 or 101 or 102? And he would say, there are 3 lessons for how to make it to my age. The first one is find somebody you love and love them fully. The second thing is find a profession you love and love it and don't let it be work. And the third was stay away from fried food. It's not good for your heart. And if you want to make it to 101 or 2, those are the 3 things you do. Of course, there was an asterisk that said you also have really good genes. But that was the words of advice that he gave the kids that they held on to every single year. And it's just such a wonderful blessing for us to have this Scholar in Residence series every year as a way of keeping their memories alive. The second pitch, as I mentioned this last night, because we were wrestling and struggling with some of the things of Israel that, you know, Zionism, what does it mean? And one of the things that I said at the end is, if you were looking at the previous election, at this last election, saying, I don't know if I can go to Israel because of what happened at that election, I said that this is now the time that you need to go to Israel more than ever. Rabbi Miller and I are taking 2 buses to Israel, and we've got about 47 people signed up right now. We have at least 3 more seats that we have to fill, but we can fill, I think, probably another 2 more seats that we need. What? Do I hear one with the seat? We have 50. Now you can just sign up. And let's finish filling those buses fully. This is the time more than ever that we should go to Israel and engage with the people of Israel. And remember that our love of Israel is not predicated on the government of Israel, but Israel as a whole and the Jewish people there and our connection to our homeland. And it's time, if you've never been, this is the time to go to Israel. So if you want more information, you can find either Rabbi Miller or myself after the lecture. When the lecture is over, we're going to go down to the media center for bagels and coffee and schmoozing and chatting. At 12:30, we're back up here for lunch. If you didn't sign up for lunch, don't worry, come anyway. We're going to have a wonderful time. I gave an introduction to Professor Troy last night. I'm not going to repeat the whole thing, but he is an enormous mind when it comes to Zionism, when it comes to Israel advocacy. You should definitely read the Herschel books that have just been published. Zionist Ideas has a wonderful take on all of this, as well as a beautiful introduction from Natan Sharansky on why you should read the book and why it's so important. Distinguished professor from McGill University, and if you want the full bio, rewatch last night's video for those of you who were here anyway. Professor Choi, coffee shop.
Shabbat Shalom. And Boker Tov. I like the first piece of advice. I like fried food too much to take the third. Thank you, Rabbi, and I'm honored to have Rabbi Miller here as well. It's exciting as an American Jew living in Israel to walk into an amazing building. One of the things that Israelis never understand, and they always kind of do a double take, is when I explain to them that every single building, every single institution, every single salary, every single pension in the American Jewish community is not paid for by the government, but paid for by the generosity of you. And because they've just grown up in a world where the government pays for Jewish institutions. And it's one of the most powerful ways of explaining to them some of the miracles of the Jewish world outside of Israel. We simply take for granted. So it is indeed moving to walk into an amazing building. But even more moving is to walk into a building with soul. And to hear how you open up your home and your hearts to anyone who needs it. And to feel the love that you have for one another, the Jewish people, and for the state of Israel, and for just a random traveler from Jerusalem, really is why it's worth spending Shabbat outside of my home, leaving my family and meeting new friends. And back when travel was a verb, we did it much more. We just talked about the simple bageling, which is you're traveling around and you somehow connect with people and you realize that in Israel, by the way, my kids and I talk, when we hear people speaking Hebrew, start speaking Hebrew outside of Israel, we call that trembo, into those gooey delicacies that only come out in the fall, otherwise they melt. But what's bagling all about? It's not all the work we're going to people. It's like we're family, we have something in common. And in a world where nationalism is often a dirty word, and I say my form of nationalism has a first name and a middle name, liberal democratic nationalism. And I know that nationalism is a neutral term. We Jews in the 1940s experienced nationalism at its ugliest and its most murderous during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. And the same decade in the 1940s, 1948, we experienced nationalism at its most liberating. So like most tools in the world are neutral, so it depends on what we do with it and how we do it. And so that's actually one of the challenges science is because nationalism is a dirty word. Jewish nationalism is not dirty. And it's one of the things we have to overcome. But before we get into politics and the history of Reform Zionism, it's Shabbat morning, so indulge me with the Torah. Another thing we take for granted is that we're all the same. Jews all over the world, and it doesn't matter what denomination you are reading and concentrating this week on Vayikra. About and thinking about the story of Jacob. And by the way, to echo your words, when we read Bereshit, we read Genesis, we don't read a story of like a happy, perfect family. And that's why they love one another, and that's why we love them. We learn that family, but family can be complex. And that we still understand. In fact, by seeing the complexity, we double down. We don't run away. That's true love. And that's the general story of Jacob. But of course, he's having a tough portion. He's having a tough portion. He's terrified about the reunion with his brother. And he divides his people, his mini tribe, into two camps. That's partially about military strategy. But some of the rabbis or mystically say, maybe it's also a way of saying that he has two different approaches, two different strategies, two different understandings of his relationship to God, two different selves, or two different dimensions to himself. And then, in the climactic portion of the poem, he wrestles with this force, this celestial force. And as a result of that wrestling, and again we see that The Jewish journey is not always easy, it's not always smooth. Some people like to say, because they know you're trying to look for new conceptions of ways of understanding our relationship with Israel. So a very popular phrase is hugging and wrestling. I don't like that much. I like hugging always and wrestling when necessary. Because that's the kind of balance I was trying to talk about last night with identity designers. Understanding foundationally how deeply tied we are, but also understanding that sometimes we have to roll up our sleeves and get our things. His name is changed from Yaakov, with all the baggage that entails, all the cheating and all the fighting and all the manipulation and all the unbrotherly love that he showed, or the brotherly unlove. And that's a name, some say it comes from, like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs would say, Yashar, straight. So if Yaakov is twisted and turned, Israel is straight. Others say you can hear Yisrael Sar, which is minister, and we see the two sides of Israel and of Zionism and the Jewish people, which is we are both a people and a religion we talked about last night by Oreo Cookie. We also have our spiritual and our more material side. And some come to go even further and say that when you read where Israel shows up in the story and where Yaakov shows up in the story, Israel reflects the spirituality, the spiritual side, the more universal side. And Yaakov is the more material, political practice. And I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about Zionism today. There are two different sides. And there's a struggle between the spiritual and the political. And we don't always make these false choices. As Scott Fitzgerald said, the mark of an intelligent person is the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time. And that's why I call myself a Fitzgeraldian Zionist. I struggle with the high ideals and the frustrating realities. The beautiful achievements, and some sin. I'm not afraid to use words. I struggle with the spiritual side and the political side. And I struggle also, I know this is a central issue in the reform movement today, with how to balance the universal and the particular. And I know there's an interesting challenge on campuses today. But it's not just today. Think about it. And when we think about it in history of reform Zionism, we have to take our lens and look at it historically over the centuries that reform has been around. The reform movement was reform movement. The reform movement emerged the Enlightenment, the Emancipation. After centuries of Jews being forced to the ghetto, Jews not being accepted, this was an attempt to somehow work with the outside society. Since the 1700s, the Jews just wanted to be citizens of the world. In fact, there's an old joke about traveling salesmen, which I've updated for college campuses. Where there are three kids sitting around in a college dorm. And at a certain point, talk turns to religion. And a guy says, hi, my name is Muhammad, Muslim. And a woman says, my name is Catherine, I'm Catholic. And third, John says, my name is John, I'm a citizen of the world. And they both go, oh, a Jew. The centuries of being honored, the centuries of being disrespected, the centuries of being broken down, the opportunity to fit in, the opportunity to belong, what are citizens of the world? But what does real citizenship require? Belonging. Mama Troy warned me, if you're so open-minded, your brains fall out. You have to be rooted in your story. I talked about this yesterday about Nelson Mandela. And there's this wacky guy in Israel named Zev Magen, who wrote this great book called John Lennon and the Jews. And he says, what's John Lennon's most famous post-Beatles song? Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no countries, there's no boundaries. It's a nightmare. Someone tried to impose that. Whole tried to impose that. It's a kind of false thought of universalism, and these are people who are often willing to sacrifice humans on the altar of their vision of humanity. And how does he explain it? That I explain it from a heteronormative male perspective. You fall in love with an amazing. and you invite her out to a restaurant. But of course, before that, you have a cousin in the jewelry business, you buy a rock. You put it in your pocket, you hope she doesn't notice that you're limping. She doesn't notice how much lighter your wallet has gotten, but still the heaviness of the rock. And there, at a certain point, middle of dinner, get down on your hands and knees, say, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you so much. I love you as much as every waitress in this restaurant. I love you as much as every woman I've ever dated. I love you as much as my grandmother and my aunt and my high school girlfriend. As the love of your life walks out of you, and as you have a new pain, let's just say in your heart, you've discovered that love is preferential. You've discovered the act of citizenship. You've discovered what Reshit, what Genesis teaches us, which is family and love and commitment and connectedness and rootedness and overcoming imperfections, overcoming challenges because you're not running away, because it's not disposable. And so the best way to keep them along, the best way to help homeless people is not simply to hear this as they walk by, but to bring them into your home. And so this false debate between universalism and particularism misses that you achieve universalism, you achieve to go on through particularism, through pride, through values, and to make that fun for our kids. By giving a particular tradition, and not saying, as I said last time, I'm not saying mine is the best or the only, but it's mine, it's ours, our conversation, it's our framework. And I find that that's a way of giving our kids some grounding in this world that I was arguing yesterday. If this race wipes out identity, if this race wipes out values, this world that is in such people, that's turning, setting us ultimately in little fragmented places, but not rooting us in our identity. With all the challenges that having a particular tradition, a particular family, a particular set of commitments entail. But those challenges become opportunities. That's a long-winded introduction. What I promised you yesterday would be the two dilemmas I'm going to focus on. 5 years ago, in a few days, on December 7th, Donald Trump gets up and he says in 1995, Congress adopted the Jerusalem Embassy Act, urging the federal government to relocate the American embassy to Jerusalem and recognize that that city is Israel's capital. This act passed Congress by an overwhelming bipartisan majority and was reaffirmed by a unanimous vote in the Senate only 6 months ago. Yet for over 20 years, every previous American president has exercised the law's waiver, refusing to approve the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem or recognize Israel as Israel's capital. And then Donald Trump, detested by 78% of the Jewish community. I couldn't call my friends during the Trump administration without saying, how's the weather? I just call him and say, how you doing? And especially, I think, in the reform movement, such a hated figure, such a detestable figure. For so many, and I'm being careful because I want to acknowledge that there may be different perspectives of the movement. I'm speaking sociologically, I'm not judging, right? I'm trying to get to the dilemma. So what do you do when this person who you detest does something that you and your people are looking for in the United States Congress and every president? George Bush in 1972 had this platform to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Jimmy Carter in 1966 said we have to move the platform the embassy to Jerusalem. And now, 5 years ago, what should the reform movement do? As reform Zionists, do you say thank you? We detest so much what you do, but in this particular case, you say thank you. And we know that the exact same words, if they had been uttered by Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, would have had church bells pealing. People would have put church bells on top of synagogues where you peal church bells. That's it. Thank you. And it wasn't. It's split in the reform movement. Now, I don't do personalities. So some of the leadership reported in the New York Times attacking the movement. And it just so happened that it was the meeting of the biennial Union of Reform Judaism Conference. And I think the quotation appeared in the New York Times on Thursday, and then all of a sudden, there's this huge split. People say, wait, how did you do that? We've been our relationship is 2,000 years old. It transcends whatever's going on in the presidency at this moment. They say, no, no, no. This is where the house is required. We've got to. And in fact, the next morning, the same leader who had been quoted in the New York Times got up and gave a Torah, but I gave about the power of Jerusalem. So think about just all the different tensions in that very decision, in that very power struggle, political and spiritual, on both sides, American and Zionist. Dilemma one. Dilemma two, more personal. I was given the challenge a few years ago of updating a book that we in the Young Judeo Youth Movement, and I can't tell you my background, called The Zionist Bible. It was a book written by, put together by Arthur Hertzberg, a rabbi in New Jersey, who in 1959 put together all the foundational texts, 34 texts about Zionism, about this crazy idea that, of course, is as old as Abraham and Sarah, as old as our parsha today, our 14th day, but in its modern manifestation was given a big boost, as I said last night, 125 years ago, in 1897, by Theodore Herzl of the Zionist Congress. But think about it, in the 1880s, 1890s, what's the big story in Eastern Europe and the Eastern European Jewish world? Not the few nutniks going to Palestine. It's the 2 million Jews on the boat, as if it was one the boat, going from 1880 to 1920 here. Right? And I don't know, some of you, like me, were probably traumatized by watching Yentl. And you know, and if you've seen Yentl, you think of stuff flew on the boat to go, not true, right? The passage was difficult and cramped and crowded and dirty and dysentery, but we named it there is a miracle called the American Church. That's the big story from the 1880s and 1920s. And there are a couple of crazy people going on that. And Hertzberg left the 34 leading field thinkers. Theodore Herzl, Ada Rabbi Koch, Alfred Gordon. He's like the foundational Zionist figures. And I was given the tremendous honor in 2018 to update it. Now again, we looked at this book as the Zionist Bible. But first of all, there were certain things we were missing. There was no women, not old meter, not 100 years old, not the focus Rachel. We also had to update it. And so, but I don't know if you got the memo that a lot of kids these days have much shorter attention span than our parents and grandparents did. So if it went 4,000 to 5,000 words manifestos in this book, I had to cut, and add. So I ended up drawing them, and the science, they did the science ideas. Instead of having these 34 thinkers, I had 168. I had 168 thinkers. Ethiopian Zionists, gay Zionists, feminist Zionists, left-wing Zionists, right-wing Zionists. And then, of course, it's been destroyed in prison order. And so I wrote it historically until 1948, the pioneers, the crazy people. 1948 to 1998, the builders. And today, who are we? I go to one of my friends, who's a leading scholar in Jerusalem. I said, what are we? What is our generation? Not just the kids, but us too. They said, we're the nothings. We're the torchbearers. So what does being a torchbearer mean? It means like in an Olympic race, everybody's thinking about the Mondial, there's a thing called the Olympics. In an Olympic race, what happens? The relay comes from one so you inherit the torch from somebody else. We're inheriting the torch from our parents and our grandparents, the founders, the builders. And you might even put an alternate energy source, but the idea is to keep it going, keep it inspiring, and then pass it on. And that's why you should join this amazing tradition. And I don't get a percentage of the program. So that was historically easy for me. But then what I did was I organized it by 6 schools of thought. I started, and by the way, I'm not a very sophisticated thinker. I just went back to another educator from New Jersey, Mel Reesfield, who ran the Hebrew school at Temple B'nai Abraham for many, many years. And we were at Camp Yehuda, we were 15-year-old kids on the banks of the Delaware River on a hot, muggy day, and he wants to teach us Zion. So he'd say, I need a black beard, I need a white beard, I need a hoe, and I need a wheel. They go, okay, Mel, he's off his rock. A doesn't have his R's, but that's okay. That's a good thing. Queens. But a wheel, what's he talking about? It's actually really clever. The Blackbeard, Theodore political Zionism. We are a people. We have rights to particular homeland. There's others who have rights to. It says let's not go about Manhattan. And the right to establish a state of political science, Blackbeard. The Whitebeard was Robert Cook, religious science. That there's something deep, organic in the Jewish people and from the Bible. By the way, Robert Cook, extremely religious Jew. When he was told, oh, look at those poets seeing those pioneers that are coming to take off their kippot, being on their Kobe temples, just the heat, they disrespect religion, go after them. He did go after them. He went up north to a settlement, back when the settlement was neutral term. And on a Saturday night, danced with them. And he said, you are making the desert bloom. You are returning to the land. You understand the power of the Bible. You understand the power of Reitman and Rashid. You're my people. You're my children. And not only did he dance with them, but some of them were dressed as Bedouins, and at the time they might kind of fit in, and even this beautiful kaftan. Let's less figure that word, right? Great word. And they switched, and they danced together into the night. And so too, let us always remember that we are one. The lesson is also often forgotten in the Jewish world today. So that's the white period religious science. And then the hoe was the labor Zionists. And Zionist vision of theirs isn't quite up to date with the start of nation. What they understood and what we have to learn from them is that they didn't say, oh, I have my socialist side, my universalist side, and my particular side, but they integrated it, they linked it together. They understood the love of referendum, they understood the power of citizenship, they understood the power of doubling down into your identity in order to reach out. The liberal democratic nationalists. Again, an important lesson. And the fourth was the wheel. The wheel was a haram. The cultural side is the Jewish people are a wheel. We have a center, Israel, and like spokes on the wheel, crazy people will come from Jerusalem and yak at you on their Shabbat morning. We'll see, as I said yesterday, Yerushalayim Shel Zahab. We'll have a common culture linked in, and that was even before Fauda and in treatment all those other amazing Israeli cultural opportunities now. So we have the Blackbeard, the universal education revolution. The Whitebeard, religious Zionism, political Zionism, religious Zionism. We have the hoe, social Zionism. We have the wheel, Jewish cultural Zionism. We make a fist, talk about revisionist Zionism, Zev Jabotinsky, and the liberal capitalism of that revolution, which was part of Start of the Nation. And those are the five main schools of Zionist thought we learned about based on all these fields. And I added a sixth. I added diaspora Zionism, which I also call identity Zionism. Because Zionism started in the diaspora. And I wanted to acknowledge and validate the entire Jewish world. Now, you know those awful light bulb jokes? Easy moment, trigger warning. How many ultra-Orthodox does it take to change a light bulb? You want to change? How many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? You can only change if you really want to change. How many gurus does it take to change a light bulb? Just trust your inner light. How many men does it take to change a light bulb? One, he holds on to the light bulb, the whole world revolves around him. How many feminists does it take to change a light bulb? That's not funny. I did a men joke and sort of saving from the feminist attack. How many does it take to change a light bulb? The traditional answer was 5. 1 to change the light bulb. 2 is to go around the a 4th to complain about the media coverage, and the 5th to write the check. One time you were not Israel, you not make a speak, but we did check. That doesn't work. That's not a relationship. That's not love. That's not citizenship. That's not particularly leading to universalism. And so the Jiu-Jitsu being different, I want to change. And the reason why I'm here today is to try and get us thinking about the power of and I'm not defining each other by what we don't do, but what we do. Not defining us by where we disagree, but also where we agree. And building that sense of consensus, building that sense of family, building that sense of love. So, what is it that's really important? Actually, was it? I'm making these 6 boxes. And clearly in the modern era, it's much of a fits diaspora Zionism. But in the earlier days, does Reform Zionism fit in with religious Zionism? Or does it fit in with labor social Zionism? And that's actually the dilemma with those around see how much politics about the spirit, how much is it about the particular moment, and how much is it. And of course, so many people in the religious world, there's no agreement in religious Zionism for Reform Zionism because the reformers are still in the black. That's why I particularly chose to put Reform Zionism into the religious Zionist category. Because when you actually read Reform Zionism, you see that it is deeply, deeply spiritual. It is about this link between the spiritual and political, and without the sense of godliness, without the sense of holiness, without the sense of spirituality, there is no deep understanding of science. And we have to acknowledge, of course, that it's been a journey. Because Reform originally came up in reaction to ultra-Orthodoxy, and in reaction to the ghetto, and the desire to fit in was so important. And because the very people who established this congregation in the mid-19th century were so anxious to be accepted. Let's be honest, there's something really threatening about the science. No, there's something doubly threatening about the science. First, the notion we want to be accept us. Let's find a country without this deep anti-Semitic tradition that they find in Europe, they find in the Muslim. We don't want to have accusations of dual loyalty that we're tied to some other place over there in Palestine. We want to be tied here. But more than that, as part of the rebellion against the and part of the desire to be part of what we now call the Judeo-Christian connection, there's a central strain in Reform thought that said we are no longer a people. And in fact, the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform, articulating American Reform Judaism, we consider ourselves no longer a nation, we're a religious community just like the Christians. And so we can have church, they can have church, we can have synagogue, and then we can go out and be normal, be accepted, be Americans, be like I talked about last night, don't try. History doesn't always corroborate with ideology. And history started pushing. There's a Supreme Court justice by the name of Louis D. Brandeis, who was a famous progressive lawyer. And he grows up in a highly assimilated, German-rooted family in Kentucky, of all places. Ends up in Boston as a crusading lawyer, brilliant student at Harvard Law School. And despite all his sophistication, despite all his literacy, he knows very, very little about the Jews. And at a certain point in his 50 or so, he meets a group of young Jewish workers who are striking, fighting for justice. And as you quote Oprah Winfrey, call it a aha moment, or call it a come to Jesus moment, whatever. He has a realization, oh my goodness, I'm part of this crazy conversation about values actually resonates very much with what my American progressive values are. He starts becoming more involved in the Jewish world. He's good friends with this guy you may have heard of named Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson becomes president. He ends up on the Supreme Court. He ends up also being the leader of the American Science. Now, how could you be Louis Brandeis, Supreme Court justice, good progressive, crusading lawyer, Harvard Law superstar? And he writes this amazing thing. This is the new vision of America. The Irish come here, and they're more rooted in who they are, and they're more proud of themselves when they become truly people of America. And the same with the Italians, and the same with Jews. It's not evil loyalty. It's not only that, but he brings its liberalism, uses its liberal ideas, progressive ideas, to link Zionism in America. And there's this other woman by the name of Henrietta Zoll, who rather than being up in the clouds, says, we're part of the people. And those people need help over there. And even though we're going to be here, like a Haran, we're going to see some inspiration, some light through the spokes on the wheel. But more than that, we're going to lower our cities. We're going to help them establish a medical infrastructure. We're going to help establish youth aliyah places when there are kids who come to Palestine and their parents can't make it or have been killed. They're going to have homes. And we're going to make this elaborate infrastructure through this organization called Hadassah. And so things start changing. The Brandesian synthesis is saying, no, you don't have to make these automatic choices. Henrietta Zoll gives a practical dimension to science. And then unfortunately, Hitler's hatred makes it really clear that we cannot distance ourselves from our brothers and sisters. We cannot distance ourselves from the problems elsewhere. And this new community that's emerging in Palestine is worth our help. And in 1937, the Reform Movement's Columbus platform affirms the Jewish people and the obligation to aid in upbuilding Palestine's future. And that's not talking about the Palestine. We just celebrated the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Partition Plan. But I don't call it the partition plan because that emphasizes the division. I call it the affirmation of Jewish statehood plan. And we're building up to the 75th anniversary of the state of Israel. We'll talk about that more at lunch or after lunch. The leaders of that fight in America were people like Rabbi Stephen Wise, people like Rabbi Avimelech Silver. There's in fact an infamous story, which probably isn't true, but it's a great story, that when Avimelech Silver was fighting with Harry Truman, they pointed his fist on the Oval Office head. Didn't really happen. But it shows how passionate he was and how frustrated he was. I think Harry Truman was by how pushy those troops were. Something about that too. But of course, we know it all worked out. And so Reform Zionism became a central part of American Zionism. And you can't really distinguish between the two. The two are happening. They were all happening. We're becoming more Americanized, more comfortable in our own skins. We're more willing to stand up and say we are proud Jews. Back when APAC had its policy conference, I'd walk around and I'd be so moved by the delegations from different temples, synagogues, and I'd be so moved also. I was the only Jewish conference I ever went to where I saw grandparents and parents and kids coming together and having that sense. I hold it the big pro-Israel American Jewish movement. But it was a real miracle. It was about that big understanding that we can assert power without being broken down Jews. It was the Zionization of the American Jewish community. It was the affirmation of the Zionist of the American Jewish community. And part of it also was 1967. 1967, in May 1967, everybody's sure that the Arabs could throw the Jews into the sea. One of my mentors, Erwin Cotler, great human rights activist from Canada, that country up north. His wife Ariella was a 19-year-old recruit in Tel Aviv at the time. They dug out infrastructure for 10,000 graves because that's what they expected by that. May 1967, one of the most terrifying moments in Jewish history. Where, as Erwin has told me, he grew up in the 1940s. The 1940s, what did you learn as a Jewish kid? That which is inconceivable is nevertheless possible. And so in May 1967, when the Arabs united and said, that which is inconceivable is nevertheless possible, we have to take them seriously. And the euphoria after 6 days was such that Eugene Barowitz, one of the great Reform theologians, says all of a sudden, and he was often on the universalistic side, he was often fighting this other guy by the name of Rabbi Nick Kirby, that we don't need to do it so central. But he said all of a sudden I had a very personal existential sense of the particularity. Why is that at the beginning? The particularity of what it is to be a Jew, the specificity of being a Jew as a member of the ethnic community. The whole Jerusalem was captured and was somehow that marvelous word powers. It hit us with an impact which we couldn't imagine. And suddenly we realized the depths of which we had in a very specific place. Abraham Joshua Heschel said, we've been so taken by the swimming pools at the Tel Aviv Hilton that we forgot Tel Chai, which is one of the places that was an important battle in the 1920s to establish the Jewish state. And so Barwith never missed the old city in the 19 years it was controlled by Jordanians and trashed and desecrated. He never missed the Kotel. But once it was ours, he saw how central it was. Once it was ours, he saw how important it was. And once the country is sitting there in Moscow hears about this liberation, he understands how important it is. And it became this uniter. And person I mentioned, Rabbi Richard Hirsch, who just died a year ago, extraordinary person, articulated what he called Reform Jewry's declaration of not independence, but interdependence. I love that. The declaration of interdependence. Of people in faith, of Jewish tradition and contemporary needs, of the universal and the particular, of Israel and diaspora, of each Jew with all Jews. The establishment, protection, and development of the state of Israel are integral premises of progressive Jewish belief, Hirsch wrote. This eternal covenant between God and the people of Israel is inseparable from the land of Israel, because that's the platform, that's the setting, that's the place where it all took place. That was my last edition. And Rabbi David Ellison has continued that teaching. He criticizes secular Israelis also for building their identity purely on secular grounds. And says, you have to understand who we are and why we're here. And he celebrates the Jewish people's return to history, the mystical, as religious moment. Reform Zionism, he wrote in 2014, needs to know and affirm the religious significance of the political act. The religious significance of this political act. And so, Jacob and Israel, universalism and particularism, is one. Our Zionism must be built upon the dialectical foundations of universalism and particularism and interplay between them. As a tikkun, in June 5 years ago, after this split in the reform movement, what do you do? The reform movement decided to resist the headlines announcing the growing unprecedented rupture between American Jewry and Israel. They read the polls that show that 83% of American Jews say they're proud of Israel for all the tension, for all the challenges, and those numbers continue. And they decided to double down on what President and Rabbi Rick Jacobs of the URJ called our ties to Israel. And the URJ's North American Board passed a resolution reaffirming the Jerusalem program that says Zionism, the national liberation of the movement, Zionism, the national liberation movement of people, Jewish, Zionist, democratic, and secure state of Israel be the expression of the common responsibility of the Jewish people for its continuity and peace. I wish that very important statement by the board had made the same front page headlines in the New York Times that the quote showing ambiguity and ambivalence and general dismay, which I respect, about the Trump decision had made. Of course it did. And so somebody wrote the Jerusalem vote, it's outrageous. With one move, that darn movement, the reform movement, defied 3 stereotypes distorting the Jewish and American conversation about Israel. Its work to get towards Zionism when it really knows its members are liberal traders who put the liberalists and Zionists in the past. How dare you refute the claim that relations between American Jewry and Israel are true? And how dare those performers who think universalist and anti-Israel drift everyone insists in sweeping American Jewry? That Congress was me. I'm here because I know it's a lie. I'm here because I know how deep the ties go. I'm here because I want to defy the haters and the dividers and the fragmenters. I'm here because Tikkun Olam starts at home and starts with us. It starts with one another. It starts with working together. It starts with understanding that Zionism is not a tool of division, it's a tool of unity. It's not a failure for all its challenges, but it's a remarkable success story. And it's a miracle, not just because of God, but because of each and every one of you, and each and every one of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and our ancestors and our leaders, and that is why Reform Zionism fit into the religious Zionist category. And that is why I'm so proud to be countercultural. And that is why I'm so proud to be here and have this conversation with you. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, criticisms, any points? No. I would say, by the way, that I had a friend in Jerusalem when I first came to Israel on my year in Israel program. those very important gap year programs, which some of our kids go on. And you walk into his house, and you go, "See how much shameful he or she who is shy does not eat." Basically saying, "Here's the fridge, it's yours, take it." And I always say, and I can say this to my students at the opening of McGill University, he or she who is shy does not learn. And so the best way to learn is by asking questions or by making comments. And that was my way. That's an old professor's trick. You do it like a slide where you talk. And this way you give people a chance to formulate their question.
So
No such thing.
and stuff and John Lennon. What was it about people having dollars?
So what happened the same thing. So what happened was that especially in the 30s and 50s, then it built with people like Pol Pot in the 1970s. The notion was that they were coming in to impose a universalism on everyone. Right? What was the socialist ideal as distorted by the Soviets? Right? The Soviets said we're a workers' paradise. And I have not seen, I'm happy to be corrected, but I've never seen, I see the beautiful, and by the way, despite her love relationship I mentioned, I have my wife and I have a disagreement with this because she loves the John Lennon song. But and I understand that aspiration behind John Lennon song. But I as a historian have never seen a universalist succeed in universalism on a national scale. I've only seen it do one of two things: either become horrifically violent, totalitarian in the way of Stalin and Pol Pot and other universalist dictators, or, as we sometimes see happening in parts of America today, it's soul stripping. And it certainly doesn't work from generation to generation. And that's why I say I'm not arrogant enough to say that our way is the best way, but I'm not creative enough to make up another way. And I'd rather invite my kids and root my kids and the birthright participants with whom I work in a 3,500-year-old conversation about how to do good, about how to find meaning, about how to do tikkun olam. I'd rather root them in some kind of structure. I'd rather root them in a series of heroes from golden years of Maccabees. I'd rather root them in real stories and real meaning. And so I can understand the beauty of the John Lennon, we'll call it the Leninist aspiration. But unfortunately, the Leninist with an O was hijacked by the Leninist with an I, and often became murderous. And so that's why I it's a controversial critique because you disagree. How can everybody happens? Imagine if you saw. But as a political historian, I go that next step and say, well, how's it really work? But more than that, someone who travels around America today, and in general the Western world, and I see, and again, I'm not some Luddite who hates technology, and I'm not somebody who just wants to go backwards. Theodore Herzl had the perfect vision. Forward and backwards. It was called Alt Neuland, Old New Land. I want to be rooted in the past, but I also want to transcend the past. I want to be thinking about the future, but I also don't want to be so jazzed by the future that I don't learn lessons of the past. And so it's a sifting, it's a constant sifting. I learn that which is good, that which is holy, that is worthwhile from the past. And that's the reform movement. It's best. The reform movement gave a gift to the entire human world. Saying we can't be stagnant. Right? Even the most religious Jews don't like to admit it. But the traditional metaphor was a tree of life. Now it's true, there's a tree right behind you. If I sit there and watch the tree, I'm not going to see a change. But if I come back here, here in the 18th, oh no, it wasn't here. In 1920s, it was built, and we see the tree grow. So Judaism always had a certain built-in mechanism. The first reformers kind of took that mechanism and they maybe put it on hyperspeed. And today, I understand Rabbi Miller trying to figure out a new balance. But that's the beauty of Judaism. That's the beauty of being a part of this amazing tradition. We really live in a model. We also be a little scared about it. We can really embrace tradition. Beautiful. Not letting tradition come handcuffs or blinded. 1, 2, 3. Yes. Sorry, I don't know.
Sometimes, you'll hear people who are, say, against the state of Israel will say, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. Do you see a differentiation, or is that just a more politically correct term, a safer term to say you're, rather than admit you're anti-Semitic, but just say anti-Zionist. Is there a difference? Or
Right,
do you want
right.
to say?
There's a theoretical opportunity to truly just be anti-Zionist. If you reject all forms of nationalism, right, and you say, I don't want this nationalism, I don't want that nationalism, side from a John Leninist, then you can say I'm an anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic. But in practice, most anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic, and the burden of proof is not on me, my friends. In the same way as I learned from my African American friends and my feminist friends and my LGBT friends in the university, the burden of proof on the person who might potentially be offended, it's on the offender. When I look at how much they use anti-Semitic stereotypes, good old-fashioned Jew, when I look at their obsession in Israel as the Jew of the world, when I look at their associations with so many haters, I take the burden of proof on you, my friends. You have to prove that you're just making this theoretical case. And the second piece of it, one of the reasons why I was emphasizing, this goes back to the question I think that Stephen mentioned yesterday, of why I emphasize identity Zionism, is because identity Zionism emphasizes that Zionism is so central to our story, so central to our text today in synagogue, so central to who we are, that you can't really say, oh, I'm only anti-Zionist. But I'm not really anti-Semitic. It doesn't work. And the more we understand it and explain it to our kids, the more we have that Pilates that I was talking about that strong core, the more we can understand. And by the way, why is it that only with Israel we have to go from anti-occupation or anti-beating or anti-finger to this right or anti-Israel? Why do we jump into that dehumanization derby? Why are we so careful with so many other ethnicities and nationalities and people to respect their person? Not even have a microaggression, and yet on campus and elsewhere, macroaggressions against Zionists are all okay. And one last one, right, is that there's a professor, the father of like Daniel Pearl, in Los Angeles, who said, you know what? Let's stop this debate by calling it Zionophobia. Not the fact that they hate Zionists. The simple fact that they hate me because I was born in Israel, or I because I live in Israel, it's a prejudice that's unacceptable enough. Yes, sir, you want to respond?
So would you, so if somebody gives that comment, I'm not anti-Semitic, just anti-Zionist, what would you say to that individual? Do you challenge them on that?
I said, first of all, look what you're going to do with. You show me that you show the difference. Right? When they say it, they're saying that they want me to show the difference. And I want them to show where they're not obsessed with Israel, not using traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes, or aligned with people who truly hate Israel. And there's a whole other dimension to it, which is that they're then also trying to define my identity. And again, I can invite them. I say, you want to criticize a particular thing? Let's talk about that. But why, in academia, we're taught never to essentialize. And all of a sudden, when it comes to Israel, we essentialize. There's something wrong here. They don't feel the whole package is somehow wrong. That doesn't pass the anti-Semitic smell test. For 3 years, they've been essentializing us Jews. For years, they've been otherizing us. And they're just now essentializing and otherizing Israel. So I recognize the historical pattern. It's on them to break it. Yes, there was a question here.
Yeah, so the question is the 4 constructs. I'm not going to go on the 5th and the 6th. So, an Israeli captain, 5'2", running on our dome. We've got the white beard, that's black beard, the white beards, the yeshiva bookers, the kibbutzniks, like into the hose, and then the culturalist, I'll say, startup nation, biotech, and information technology, among other categories. So how is that all? Tell me about how that dynamic is playing out.
It's an amazing improvisational translation of my stuff into reality. I love that. Thank you. Look, part of the reason why I like to emphasize that is because in an age where difference is usually meant to be the start of a civil war, I want difference to be the start of a conversation. And so I'm able to say that we can all agree on the fundamentals of Zionism. The Jews are a people, not just a religion. The Jews have got particular homeland. The Jews are established state on that homeland. And yet we have long had different expressions and different ideas that add to that. And indeed, go back to the 1930s and 1920s, sometimes those differences are downright murderous. Right? And whatever we think is going on in the Jewish world today, we can see we're raised. So, but for me, it's a way of also saying to students, what was the movement of the Zionist idea to the Zionist idea? it's saying that this is a big, broad conversation. One of the things that is so disturbing to me, and I mentioned this last night too, is that my friends on the right have one idea of how to be pro-internet. And it's smothering me. I don't know how to have a healthy democratic conversation if we can't have self-criticism. If there's zero tolerance for any kind of criticism. And my friends on the left are too often too happy to sort of join whatever people to the next derby, both what I was saying there, which I guess with this policy or this action, so I reject the whole thing. So by having these schools of Zionist thought, there's lots of room to explore, there's lots of room to welcome people in, and there also are clear red lines. My big blue and white tent, like Abraham's tent, is open to the right, to the left, forward and backwards, up and right. But it also, like Abraham's tent, is boundary. It has its limits. And so when I was putting together the Zionist ideas, and by the way, I love going from Zionist idea to Zionist ideas because the S looks like a question mark. And I'm tired of all the exclamation points. I want question marks. I want questions and struggles and confusions and twisting of lines and thrusting of wires, being Fitzgerald. So I had a question when I'm going through hundreds of Zionist texts. I got a second PhD in Zionist history and speaking. Mayor Khan writes really beautiful, thoughtful things about people. He writes beautiful, thoughtful things about the need to have a Jewish parliament. And he had some Zionist texts, which if I read them to you and didn't say who they were, you'd stand up and say Hatila. You go, out with that. And I had one day where I spoke to two different people, my name was, and I said, well, do I include Mary Anna in my identity, in my Zionist anthology? And what was that? Of course, because he wrote some really beautiful stuff. And the second one said, what I actually believe, and I was asking the questions that I like to learn, was that when you cross that line into bigotry, into prejudice, into demagoguery, he broke the DNA of Zionism, which intertwines Jewish and democratic. And so he doesn't belong in that anthology. I'll be more controversial. Peter Beinart was in the first anthology. Because when he questioned how do we balance liberalism and Zionism, he's trying to struggle, I'm okay with that. But 2 years ago, when he came out of the New York Times and rejected the very notion of Jewish statehood and called for a binational state, which just doesn't seem to be realistic and misses some of the central Zionist ideas, he then left that boundary that I've created. And I think it's healthy for us to have boundaries. I'm not Mr. Cancel Culture. I want to have a big, broad tent. I listen to all 15 minutes of Dave Chappelle and I'll have my criticism. I'm so great that he didn't even explain it. That was so my instinct is driven by when I'm creating an anthology, I want to have red lines. I'm very proud of that. It wasn't an easy decision. It did Mayor Khan out, right? And this was even before the rise of Benjamin, so I think it's even more important to do that. To say we can be proud Zionists, we can be, I have lots of room for being proud Jabotinsky Zionists, but don't get undermining the discipline of the army about us. There's a question in the back.
The Pittsburgh platform reflected the contemporary American Jewish experience, and it was aspirational for acceptance in American society, which takes 60 years to realize. At the same time, Herzl has a Zionist view that is very much against the Pittsburgh platform. What did Zionism in the 19th century reform America look like?
Great question. So it was in formation. So as I mentioned last night that Herzl succeeded in Europe in getting the ultra-Orthodox and the reformers to unite and say, don't believe in unity. And that's why the conference in 1987 was in Basel. And there's a very strong strain in reform Judaism, both in Europe and in the United States, traditionally that was against Zionism. But there still were voices. Rabbi Stephen Wise, by the early 1900s, embraced the Zionist Congress and Orthodox. Or even established a synagogue, he still went forward within the Reform movement. So there were voices that were in the Reform movement, in the American Reform movement, pushing for a reconciliation with Herzl and Hertzelian Zionism. Of course, Herzl was such a great figure because he was not this heavy-handed religious guy, but he was very much from the assimilated world. And so it was if we were going to kind of, in the 3-hour version, there's 2 stages. We would say that the fact that the Zionist movement was launched by someone like Herzl was a kind of softening in the reform perspective of toward Zionism, but still it's really I mean, it starts shifting more dramatic, most dramatic in the 1920s, but it really takes the 1937, the Columbus platform for that shift. And I understand it again, because I said sociologically, ideologically, politically, but that's what was going on. Yes. One, and then there was, yes, one, yes, sir.
Please go ahead. Many anti-Zionists are themselves Jewish. So the accusation of anti-Zionism is being anti-Jewish. So. Well, it needs more explanation.
Okay, thank you. So look, as I said, we just talked about Reform Zionism in the Pittsburgh platform. There is a long, there's a tradition of critique of Zionism. But modern. So, but there are two things. One is, I think it is significant that in 1948 and in 1967, post-Holocaust, post the establishment of the State of Israel, post-May 1967, a consensus was formed in the Jewish world that Israel, the State of Israel, not just the land of Israel, is central in our hearts. And the consensus was formed, and it was reaffirmed by by every Reform convention about Zionism ever since. That from left to right, Zionism is front and center. And because we're over free people and famously chaotic people, there will be voices, Jewish voices, right? And in England, there's one writer who calls them as a Jews. I therefore say that it was bad. And so some of these people have not been very involved with Jewish world. And more problematic, I'm going to potentially be controversial here, was in May 2021, when there was this explosion. And by the way, it really goes to your question, because it's actually a perfect example of both your questions, of how this surge in anger against Israel expressed itself in an attack on people eating sushi in Los Angeles, who aren't even in Congress. Expressed itself in a bicyclist in Times Square who's simply riding, who's simply identified as a Jew. The expression of anti-Zionism usually ends up lashing out against Jews, especially in America. People don't sit, and certainly the terrorists, they don't sit and say, where are you standing? And probably feel everything, right? And so I'm and what was so painful at that moment was at this moment of tremendous Jewish pain. I can't tell you how many students and how many birthright I spoke to said, this was a moment where I realized, oh my goodness, I fit in, I belong, I have a civilization. And by the way, the Jewish community is deeply traumatized and still recovering. I was at a meeting in New York in September, and they said, oh, just call it May. No, it's too late. The time the time more than anyone else in the Jewish world was really trying to be a uniter and not a divider. And we were traumatized, not just by what was going on outside by the outsiders, but by watching Jewish studies professors and Israel studies professors write petitions about Israel as a settler colonial state. When I argued yesterday that the roots here, the roots in Israel run very, very deep. It's not a colonialist. Disagree with the settlements, but it's not a colonialist project. They called it. They accused Israel of the cleansing, the apartheid, the whole kit and caboodle, and the worst, most disgusting phrase was Jewish supremacy. And I was confused in the original Nazi term. That's where it comes from. And these creative people don't have a vocabulary that could break out of those words which are used to give it in my syndrome. And so the contrarian, I wrote a very controversial article in Catholic called calling them not as Jews, not ex-Jews, they're victims. But people say, you know what, I'll tuition $70,000 for university, just pay the Jewish studies course. They take the Jewish studies course and they're being recognized by somebody who isn't even smart enough to break out of the sub-work attack on this. That's what we call them Jews. Why? Because they're undoing the core consensus that has defined Israel and the Jewish people's relationship in the last 80, 90 years. And there's a controversial article about we stood by it. And by the way, what I love is people say, oh, we need to have a relationship with Israel, not criticize that one. And if you do criticize them, they'll as a relationship with you. In fact, one more question.
It's currently in Israel, is there a significant divide or unity among the Reform Zionists about a two-state solution?
It's a very interesting question. Because the main conversation among Reform Zionists in Israel is usually on the whole question of religion and state. And the movement has been very careful to focus on that, partially because the attacks against the Reform movement and the right and the religious right are so disgusting and so delegitimizing and so depersonal, right? That they're a little cautious on the political stuff because they just want to show that they're within consensus. But I've never met a Reform Zionist who doesn't believe in the two-state solution. So I think this it's part of the core consensus, but it's not front and center because they're fighting a different battle. They're fighting a battle for credibility and legitimacy, which breaks my heart how the way that the conversation plays out. But I will say also that many Reform Zionists, like many Israeli progressives, do approach questions of patriotism differently than we sometimes see in the progressive Zionist community here. There's a powerful moment in the 2014 Gaza war when a few voices from J Street, not even from Jewish Voice of Peace, came out very harshly against the project of the state of Israel. And the president of Peace Now in Israel wrote this powerful piece about how her husband is currently serving right now in Gaza, and how we progressive Israelis understand that there's another very important piece called patriotism. And in Israel, it's really interesting to watch how the left navigates its deep commitments to serving the army, to being patriotic, to being mainstream, while also having space for critique. But as I said yesterday, that's the best way to be a patriot. The best way to be a patriot is not to run away when you have trouble and go back. And that's what I think Zionists is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Troy. There are bagels and coffee served in the media center right now. I invite you all to head down to the media center for bagel schmoozing, chatting with Professor Troy. We'll be back here in this space at 12:30. For those who are streaming online, 12:45, maybe keep your Zoom app open, your YouTube app open. At some point, we'll go live with the next conversation, which we are thrilled and can't wait to have. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.